Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com. Dear Mr. Potter, we're pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Students shall be required to report to the Convention Centre chamber on June the 5th to register between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. A welcome reception for its first-year students will begin promptly at 6 p.m. with our icebreaker reception and dinner immediately following promptly at 6:30 p.m. Please ensure that the utmost attention is made to the list of requirements and the agenda attached herewith. We very much look forward to receiving you as part of the new generation of Hogwarts heritage. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hopton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. So, dear listeners, that is Harry Potter's letter of introduction to Hogwarts, which has been read by over 500 million people thanks to J.K. Rowling's masterpiece, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which was published, of course, way back in 1997. And I apologise for my Scottish accent, but I thought I'd try and do a take on Minerva McGonagall. I didn't realise I was going to be so bad, but there you go. So that was Harry Potter's introduction. So Harry Potter is truly a global phenomenon. It's one of those stories that's etched into the hearts of everyone under, 30, 35? I mean, we've all grown up with these tales of magic and friendship. And J.K. Rowling didn't just create an incredible story. For many, she actually became a moral guide. And some fans even say that they got their moral compass from Harry Potter. I mean, it's not just a story. It's a source of values and life lessons, much like children's classic tales throughout history. And in this podcast, we're going to explore exactly what that is and where it came from. Then I wondered, are stories about young people going away to boarding schools, with a strong moral message, is that something that J.K. Rowling invented, or do they actually have a long history? No, there are many books that people have pointed to in the past. So if you consider the stories of Enid Blyton, the Narnia stories, Tolkien's works, The Dark is Rising sequence by Susan Cooper, The Sword in the Stone by T.H. White, The Worst Witch by, Jill Murphy, there are loads of them. So it wasn't just a J.K. Rowling phenomenon. And I think one of the reasons for J.K. Rowling's success is that she wove together many elements from these classic stories. Or you could say that she's actually drawing on a very rich tapestry of material. At its core, Harry Potter is the classic school story. And I'm not the first to argue this, but it's the essence of the series. These are coming-of-age tales. I mean, who doesn't know that Harry is an orphan living in a cupboard under the stairs at his foster family's suburban home? I mean, everybody knows. And then that he receives, this remarkable letter. Yes, the one that I read so eloquently at the start of this program. And of course, off he goes to boarding school to learn witchcraft and wizardry. The device of a boy moving from obscurity to an extraordinary medieval school, making new friends, encountering school bullies, scary teachers, new codes, and a secret language. It's all a very old device in British fiction. And let me read from a novel I read over the weekend. Again, I'd actually read this many times in the past. I read it first when I went to boarding school myself, and I read it again to prepare for this podcast. It describes a boy going to boarding school very much like Harry going to Hogwarts. Tom followed his guide through the schoolhouse hall, which opens into a quadrangle. It's a great room, 30 feet long and 18 feet high, or thereabouts, with two great tables running the whole length. Two large fireplaces at its side with fires blazing in them. So that's a passage from Tom Brown's Schooldays, which was written, of course, by Thomas Hughes, published in 1857. And it's actually hard to think of any other Victorian book, or indeed any book from any era that has left such a deep imprint on the British imagination. Tom Brown's Schooldays is a foundational text absolutely, of Victorian-era Britain, and its influence extends to schools completely around the world. It's the foundational text of the culture of international sports, the Olympics, and all that comes from this one book. It's the foundational text of organized sports, of the idea of manliness, the idea of service, of moral character, of all these things. It's also one of the best selling books in any genre of the 19th century. And even as late as the 1940s, it was still one of the four top books read by British children after Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, and Gulliver's Travels. Isn't that amazing? I've also read the Flashman series, and Flashman, it turns out, is actually the bully in Tom Brown's Schooldays, who tosses Tom around in a blanket and then roasts him in front of a fire and all kinds of things like that. And then he becomes the hero of the George MacDonald Fraser stories of novels, in which Flashman, this coward and bully at school, becomes the much garlanded hero. And so I always assumed from that Tom Brown himself was a terrible kind of wuss, a bit of a wet. But actually, he isn't that at all. And the story is absolutely amazing. I mean, it's very gripping. I really enjoyed reading it again. It's all school stories woven into one. And it's also a little bit of my story. Tom is from rural Berkshire. He's a kind-hearted, athletic boy, a bit of a sort of a rascal. His father is the squire. And when Tom is 11, decides to send him to rugby school to make a gentleman of him, I suppose, to make a man of him. And Tom goes to rugby. He falls in with a friend straight away, his version of a kind of Ron Weasley, Harry Potter's friend. And his friend is actually called Harry. There's a school bully as well, a Draco Malfoy, if you like, who is Harry Flashman, who then becomes the hero of his own series of novels, as I just mentioned. Tom goes through a series of trials. He cheats in his lessons. He ends up performing very well. He adopts a boy called George Arthur, he's a cross between Dobby the house elf and Neville Longbottom. So pretty much kind of Harry's useless but lovable friend. And he's kind of an angelic swot. And evidence of his swottishness is that he reads Herodotus for pleasure. And not only that, he prays. He prays by his bedside every single night, and he actually shames the other boys into praying by their bedsides at night. And this is actually a very transformative moment for Tom Brown because he's embarrassed to do it, and he's shamed by this weedy friend of his into praying every single night. And I actually found that quite moving. It was quite a moving chapter. So the story behind the story is that this is written by a guy called Thomas Hughes, and he's a fascinating man. He himself had actually been a pupil at rugby school. He went on to become a lawyer and a Liberal MP. And would you believe, he actually tried to set up a kind of utopian society in Tennessee. So many people that I've talked about in my podcast have actually tried to do this. I've no idea why, but they do. So Thomas Hughes tried to set up this utopian society in Tennessee with its own library, its own croquet lawn, its own newspaper, but no cricket pitch. So that tells you something about his hatred of cricket. But do you know what he called it? He called it Rugby Tennessee. And he was a great enthusiast for what they called back then muscular Christianity. So this idea that you would actually teach Christian principles and kind of sporting prowess, side by side, a healthy body, a healthy mind, all that kind of thing. And Thomas Hughes would actually tour the United Kingdom, but not just the land. He would actually specifically go to northern towns, the kind of towns that actually ended up having, football clubs or soccer clubs later on, Premier League championship football clubs. He would go up there and preach gospel, not just of Christianity, but of sport. And that's, of course, why I think sport is now a major part of forming one's character, especially in the north of England. So many of the earliest football teams derived from churches. And the one that immediately comes to mind is Aston Villa, for instance, which was actually founded by the Methodists. But when you look into it, Everton, Manchester City, Wolves, Southampton, they were all founded by churches, as were, north of the border, as was Celtic in Scotland. Sports and religion were very, very closely interwoven in the 19th century. And it's all thanks to the preachings of people like Thomas Hughes. They were instrumental. And, it's really not about becoming too much of a Christian. It's also about becoming a decent chap. The key about Tom Brown right from the beginning is that he's a decent chap. So, and it's why you like him so much. So studies, when he meets him, on his first day at school from Tom Brown's Schooldays, he actually says a great deal depends on how a fellow cuts up at first. If he's got nothing on about him and he answers straightforward and he holds his head up, he gets on. And that's exactly what Tom Brown does. And when I think back to my days at boarding school, it's exactly what you do on your first day. You're being assessed by your peers, if you like, from the moment that you walk into the school. And this is basically the kind of ideal that underruns all of it. And it was, as I said, it was the same for me. When I went to Cranleigh, you're not only assessed by your peers immediately, but your first test is always the hardest. And it's always a trial of brutality. It doesn't matter which school you go to. And the thing that I like about Tom Brown so much and Harry so much is that you don't actually want to be too brilliant at anything at all from the moment you walk in the door. And it's absolutely Harry Potter. And Harry Potter is actually, he's not especially academic. He is brilliant at sports. I mean, he's extraordinarily gifted at Quidditch. Even from the Philosopher's Stone, you see that straight away from the moment that he's introduced to Quidditch. And the term that's used in boarding schools and in Tom Brown's Schooldays is that if you're good at sports, you're the cock of the school, which is basically slang, boarding school slang for you're a bit of a jock. And cock of the school is probably not a nickname that you would welcome now, of course. In fact, another expostulation which I just thought about was the senior boys used to say to the younger boys, "You young muff." And Tom Brown is actually described as the most reckless young scapegrace among the fags. So fagging is actually very important in school stories. And to those of you, probably my American listeners, fag means a different thing. But a fag in English boarding schools is effectively a younger boy who will actually act as a servant to the older boy for the entire year. And they'll be assigned to effectively a prefect. They might have to bring in breakfast, to shine his shoes, to make his bed, and they do errands for him, like carrying messages, all these kind of things. And you do it for your entire first year, so aged 10 or 11. And in some schools, I was actually talking to a good friend about this the other day. Some schools, you actually wear a different uniform. So you actually stand out like a bit of a sore thumb, and you're at the beck and call of all the older boys. And fagging actually persisted in, British schools until, I don't know, it was still there in the 1970s. So I'd have to say well after the 1980s. It was really only phased out when schools started to go co-ed. So Tom Brown is very obviously the template for Harry Potter. And it would be interesting to get J.K. Rowling's take on this. But there is no doubt in my mind that he absolutely is. He's slightly bland, but generally a very decent and admirable boy who goes through this rite of passage to make him a man, through a series of trials. But the other thing, of course, is that a key part of Tom Brown's Schooldays is the influence of the headmaster. So, of course, in Harry Potter, it's Dumbledore. Dumbledore is a huge figure in Harry Potter's life. He's the Gandalf, he's the Merlin-like figure who is, the headmaster of the school. And Tom Brown's Schooldays has its own Dumbledore, a character called Dr. Arnold, a real-life person. So the person who has actually been Thomas Hughes's real headmaster. Dr. Arnold lived from 1795 to 1842. He was head of rugby from 1828 to 1841. And he really, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say, he's one of the absolute founding fathers of the Victorian age, and certainly of the Victorian age era schools. He's absolutely a towering figure and influential, as I said earlier on, not just in Britain, but on the ideals of sport and manliness and all that kind of thing that the British Empire actually then exports. And most of you would never have heard of him. So he becomes a myth, really, in his own lifetime. For those people who listen to this podcast who were thinking, Well, this is just a public school boy talking about public schools, and he thinks all this is terribly interesting, that it's not really important to anybody else. And I'm sure you're out there. Dr. Arnold would have been a name recognizable to almost every educated person back in the 19th century, certainly in Britain and beyond Britain. And actually, his influence was carried well into the colonies, into the United States and so on. Because Baron Coubertin is directly influenced by his example in setting up the Olympics. In fact, in order to set up the Olympics, he actually visited England in the 1880s, and he made a point of visiting every public school that he could to see how they operated. And he carried with him, as a kind of spiritual guide, I guess, he carried with him a copy of Tom Brown's Schooldays. And he said what Dr. Arnold did at Rugby School is one of the great transformations in all cultural history. Isn't that astounding? To say that de Coubertin was obsessed with Thomas Arnold, well, it goes without saying. But so many, many people were. I then wondered how Dr. Arnold actually dealt with this stature. He's head of a school. It just seems very odd. And I couldn't actually imagine that happening now. Arnold had himself been educated at Winchester, which was the supporting school for Eton, which was arguably the first true public school. And I actually talked about this in my earlier episode. So Arnold himself, on his first night at Winchester, had actually knelt and prayed by his bedside. And when he did that, he was actually physically attacked by the other boys. Arnold eventually became one of the great kind of advocates of, I suppose, political liberalism and certainly Anglicanism, broad church Anglicanism in the middle of the 19th century. And he's appointed to be the head of Rugby School in 1828. And he almost quintuples the number of boys at the school within his first year. And he has this extraordinary project, which now, to some degree, I think, because so many schools, not just private schools, bear Arnold's imprint. We actually now take it for granted, but at the time, it was truly radical. He actually argued that schools should be laboratories to turn out little Christian men, and said that the important thing in school was not to fill your mind with just stuff, with education, but to form your character, your moral character. His first comments on being appointed to the headmaster of rugby, he actually says, "My object will be, if possible, to form Christian men." And in this book, Tom Brown's Schooldays, Thomas Hughes writes of the tall, gallant form, the kindling eye, the voice now soft as the low notes of the flute, now clear and stirring as the call of the light infantry bugle. Of him who stood there Sunday after Sunday, witnessing and pleading for his Lord. And this idea of, Christian manhood, and that he would send out legions of boys to be Christian men, to govern Britain, to govern Britain's empire. This absolutely caught the imagination of the Victorians. They couldn't get enough of him. So Arnold became this incredibly inspirational figure. And the interesting thing about him is, when Harry actually arrives at Hogwarts, he's already been told that there is a sort of undercurrent of danger in the character of Voldemort, the Dark Lord. And there's the dark arts, and there's this kind of evil lurking at the turn of every stair. And Arnold himself absolutely believes this. And he didn't call it Voldemort, of course, but for him, the name was sin. So he thought that all teenage boys were threatened by sin. And actually, to be a teenage boy was kind of sinful in itself. So he said there are 6 sins endemic among schoolboys: profligacy, falsehood, cruelty, disobedience, idleness, and the bond of evil. And I actually thought there was going to be another sin, because remember, I've attended boarding school. Teenage boys back in the 19th century were particularly prone to being beastly. And I'll talk about that later, because at this stage, they're not overly obsessed with sexuality. And for Arnold, it's kind of more amorphous than that. It's telling lies and not doing your bit and cheating at exams and all these kinds of things. And he believes that life is a constant struggle to overcome these sentiments. And lots of Christians actually believe this. And he believes that he can actually guide the boys towards a sort of higher state. And the way that he would do it is through a character called Percy Weasley. And of course, Percy Weasley is Ron Weasley's older brother in the Harry Potter series. And at the beginning of the book is introduced to us as Harry's catching a train. And the Weasleys are all giving Percy a bit of grief because he's actually going to be a prefect. And Arnold actually wanted to use the prefect system. So being a prefect is very, very important. And a prefect is a senior boy who will act as a kind of conduit between the headmaster and the other boys, or the other housemasters and the other boys. And the interesting thing about being a prefect is, certainly when I was at school, is that you're actually voted in by the other masters, not by the boys. So it's the masters who actually see that kind of leadership quality in you. So in the 14th century, when most colleges were set up, there were senior boys who kind of represented the other boys. And prefects were actually derived from Merton College in Oxford. Arnold's idea was the prefect would actually, instead of leading revolts against the headmaster, and if you listen to my previous podcast on this, you'll know all about the revolts that took place, and some of them were absolutely horrendous, that the prefect would actually be working for him. And he calls them aristocracy of talent and worth. So the prefect would actually dine with the headmaster. And in my day, the prefect actually dined with the housemasters. And they would sort of marshal the other boys and lead them towards better behavior. To go to a public school, you definitely have to pay for it. That's why they're called public. They're open to everybody who can afford it. So by definition, people who go to these public schools at this stage are from the elites. And I believe that Arnold is actually self-consciously training these boys to go out and govern Britain and to govern, various parts of the world that have been painted pink. He has an idea that he is actually training the moral elite. That being said, I don't think that it's an obsession. More, it's the myth of Arnold. But I then wondered, does he actually think it's important that he does this? Not just for the sake of the individual boys, but for the good of the entire country. And the conclusion that I came to is that he absolutely is. All public school headmasters are conscious that they are training an elite of boys who are going to become cabinet ministers and, churchmen and the like. I mean, if you look at the kind of people who go to public schools in the 18th and 19th centuries, they go on to become generals in the army, admirals in the navy, to become governors of the colonies, to become, MPs and all these kinds of things. They absolutely do. So in Harry Potter, Dumbledore has a host of kind of disciples, and they call themselves Dumbledore's army. The people who kind of worship Dumbledore, who, want to carry on with his example. And so does Arnold. So the heads of schools like Marlborough and Harrow and Eton, the headmaster of, King Edward's in Birmingham, they were all disciples of Arnold's. And these people go out, and for the next 50 years or so, they create this kind of regimen of Arnoldian in schools. So almost every school in Britain, every public school in Britain is true to Arnold's ethos, and grammar schools as well. And to explain to my overseas listeners, grammar schools are actually open to everybody. But to get into a grammar school, you have to pass an exam. So grammar schools will be in small towns. So Shakespeare, for example, went to a grammar school. They're initially set up to teach Latin, but you're not necessarily boarding if you go to grammar schools. In actual fact, you're not boarding if you go to a grammar school. They don't have boarding. But grammar schools increasingly kind of ape the rugby look, with prefects, etc. And in the second half of this episode, I'll be going through the aspects of the Harry Potter stories, the sport, the boarding, the houses, and talk about the history of those, because they're very important. Because schools, not just in Britain, but across the world, copy what they see as Arnold's formula. And where they're getting Arnold's formula from is from Tom Brown's Schooldays. So it came out, as I said, in 1857 and initially sold 11,000 copies. That's a lot of copies in its first year. And since then, it's been through 52 editions within about 35 years. I mentioned Pierre de Coubertin earlier on. He talked to the powerful figure of Thomas Arnold and the glorious contour of his incomparable work, and that he was absolutely obsessed by it, as I said. But just to give you two more examples, to give you a sense of the massive impact. And 1911 is important because this is just after Britain sets up state schools, which at this point don't exist. So in 1911, the British Board of Education recommended that every single school in Britain, public, state, grammar, private, must have a copy of Tom Brown's Schooldays in its library as an example to the pupils. That's the first example. The other example is that one of the most influential boarding schools that's set up in India, which is the Raj Kumar College, which was founded in 1870, the headmaster of that school used to read out the cricketing passages from Tom Brown's Schooldays at every single school assembly instead of Christian sermons, because he thought it would better influence the boys to become upstanding gentlemen. Isn't that amazing? I was also reading that Tom Brown's Schooldays was used in Japan after the Japanese had opened up to the world and were trying to learn English, which is rather amazing. You know, boys would be set to translate Tom Brown's Schooldays into Japanese. But I thought the funniest thing was that they would omit the detail of the cricket match because they didn't understand it. It was just too challenging. And I can obviously see that's where Japan went wrong. So Tom Brown's Schooldays, just to finish on this, becomes the template for a host of stories that are, I would argue, by far the most influential stories on children in Britain, and indeed in the British Empire for more broadly, let's say between 1860 and 1950 or 1960 or so. And these are the school stories that are colossally popular. And so the most famous examples of this is in something like the Boys' Own Paper. And of course, that doesn't exist anymore. But in Britain, they talk of boys' own stories even now, which are stories of kind of pluck and daring do. You know, the Boys' Own Paper actually sold 250,000 copies, and each copy was read by roughly 4 children. So its readership is about 1 million children. That's extraordinary. And the weird thing about that is that it's being read by children who have absolutely no prospect of kind of going to an ivy-clad Gothic public school. And I find this absolutely fascinating. So the other 2 great publications that are sort of the embodiment of this were The Magnet and The Gem. So these were boys' papers. And by the way, they were read by girls, but more so by boys. And there were girls' equivalents of them, but they just weren't as widely read as the boys were. And of course, they're massively popular in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. And in fact, George Orwell actually wrote a brilliant essay about them, about school stories and about their influence on British culture. And the most famous series of stories that run in them are the Greyfriars school stories, starring Billy Bunter. And I read Billy Bunter as a kid. And those stories are read by people from across the entire social spectrum. And they have far more readers who will never, ever go within 10 miles of ever going to a boarding school. And of course, they are read by boarding school schoolboys, and they are read in the colonies as well. But they're more read by people who will never go to a boarding school. And that actually just brought to mind the great C.L.R. James, an incredible Caribbean academic. He was a Marxist historian. He was an historian of cricket. He was massively influenced by these stories. He was also influenced by Marx, and of course, he was also influenced by Hughes in Tom Brown's Schooldays. And I always think that's such a weird blend. And if you've never heard of C.L.R. James, I have to tell you a little bit about him. And if you do know of him, please bear with me. So C.L.R. James went to school at Queen's Royal College, Port of Spain in Trinidad and Tobago. And as I said, he's arguably the greatest intellectual the Caribbean has ever produced. And he sometimes wrote under the pen name J.R. Johnson. His brilliant book, The Black Jacobeans, as I say, he's a great Marxist historian, a great writer on cricket. And in his autobiography, Beyond the Boundary, he actually talks about Thomas Arnold's legacy. He says, one of the most fantastic transformations in the history of education and of culture. And he says of the code of kind of manliness, decency, fair play, team spirit, pluck, that he got from school stories, he says, From the 8 years of school life, this code became the moral framework of my existence. It has never left me. I learnt it as a boy, I have obeyed it as a man, and now I can no longer laugh at it. I mean, it's such an odd kind of fusion, isn't it? The Marxism that inspired him throughout his adult life seems absolutely to have interfused with that public school spirit and Tom Brown's Schooldays. Such an influential book. So just before we go to the break, lots of younger people listening to this will think back with similar fondness, I would say, to the Harry Potter stories. Thomas Hughes said of Tom Brown's Schooldays that he wrote it to get the chance of preaching. And if I think about it now, the Harry Potter stories are quite preachy books. So, the moral lessons that each book kind of provides. J.K. Rowling, I think, was doing nothing really unprecedented at all. Because there were lots of stories, in between school stories that actually did the same thing. So if we talk about the Greyfriars stories, for example, stories of Harry Wharton and his friends, and I will be talking about them, by the way. I'm obsessed with these stories, as you know, absolutely obsessed. These stories were enormously influential on working class children. And in his brilliant book, The Intellectual Life of the English Working Class, by Jonathan Rose, who's a great historian, by the way. He has loads of examples of incredibly implausible people who found these stories their equivalent. These were their Bible. They drew on the moral code of these stories, just like people did with the Harry Potter books. And I'll give you two examples, if I may. Firstly, a boy growing up in the south of Wales called Aneurin Bevan, who's the founder of the United Kingdom's beloved National Health Service. He actually worked as a butcher's boy, and he would go to the newsagent every week with the money he earned as a butcher's boy and pick up his copies of The Magnet and The Gem, which were absolutely full of boarding school stories. His father, a miner, banned them from his house, which was actually very common. And I was then wondering, if they were very commonly banned, because they were, was it because they were being badly written, or because of the kind of moral lessons that they had in them were actually being disapproved of? And the answer that I came to was that often parents would regard the misbehavior of the boys in the stories, stealing jam, fighting, falling out of windows, wrestling with tramps, stealing from another boy's tuck box, or stealing, as I said, stealing jam from the canteen. I mean, oh my gosh, we used to steal jam from the canteen all the time because we were always bloody hungry. So, lots of parents banned them, saying that the boys should be reading something better, more improving to the spirit. But of course, kids then, like kids today, as soon as you banned something, they wanted it more. Bevan would actually sneak out and buy them anyway, and then he had to hide them under a railway bridge near his house. And it's extraordinary that someone who is thought of as being, one of the absolute titans of socialism actually did this. And the other example is a great working class historian called Robert Roberts, who grew up in Salford. And if you don't know Salford, Salford is a very much a working class mining kind of town. And he actually wrote a book about it called The Classic Slum. He said, for boys like him, he said, Greyfriars became for us the true alma mater to whom we felt bound by dreamlike loyalty. Over the years, these simple tales conditioned whole generations of boys. The public school ethos distorted into myth and told among us weekly in penny numbers set out ideas and standards. And in the final estimate, it may well be found that Frank Richards, who was the author of Greyfriars stories, had more influence on the mind and outlook of young working class England than any other person. And I think that absolutely shows that there is a living link between Tom Brown's Schooldays and Harry Potter. And people can see how that thread would have been woven through 150 years or more of British popular culture. And when I come back, I will look at how all the famous elements in the Harry Potter stories are prefigured in the Victorian public schools. And now, just a message from our sponsor.
Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com.
And we're back. Welcome to Hogwarts, said Professor McGonagall. The start of the term banquet will begin shortly, but before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you'll be sorted into your houses. The sorting is a very important ceremony because while you're here, your house will be something like your family within Hogwarts. You will have classes with the rest of your house. You'll sleep in your house dormitory and spend free time in your house common room. My accent is appalling. And just south of the border, which I'll go into English now, and so each house in the boarding school, just like in the Harry Potter series, has its own noble history. Any rule breaking loses house points, and at the end of the year, the house with the most points is awarded the House Cup. It's a great honor. For those of you who haven't been to boarding school, each house in a school is like your tribe. Your school is your school, but your house is what you will fight and die for all year, in sport, in exams. So just before we talk about the houses in a little bit, let's talk about how it all starts. Well, like Harry, he gets his letter saying that he's just been accepted, and then he has to go and get all the gear that he needs. So he goes into Diagon Alley and he starts buying stuff. And it's the same at every boarding school, every public school throughout the country. You get your letter of acceptance, you're told which house you're going to go into or been accepted into, and then you have to go shopping. You need, and these are obligatory items, you get no choice. You have to have a school scarf, a cap, a shirt or shirts, a blazer, 2 ties, 1 set of gloves, 2 pairs of shorts if you're a first year, long pants if you're a second year and above, and a duffel coat, a grey duffel coat. And of course, everything has to be then labeled with your name and your house. Then, of course, there's the sports gear. Then there's your Sunday gear that you have to attend church in. And then, of course, there's your casual gear. You're also allowed a tuck box, and your housemaster is then given cash by your parents so that he can supply you with your pocket money once a week. And crucially, Harry then gets the train. So, the Hogwarts Express. I mean, even people who haven't read Harry Potter will know about the Hogwarts Express and that it goes from platform 9 3/4 from King's Cross Station. And this is actually a well-used device in pretty much every school story because so many people, so many students went by train to public schools. And actually, the existence of the British public school network depends entirely almost on the Victorian railway system because often the point of these schools is that they are on or at or in isolated villages or towns a long way from urban centres that are actually producing the wealth that enables the parents to pay for these schools. And if you think about Hogwarts, Hogwarts is actually set in the deepest depths of Scotland. And of course, it's the last thing on the line. And of course, there's also I was just thinking about it then, there's a political criticism for public schools, isn't there? Kind of over the 20th century. This idea that it's industry that actually creates the money that then gets spent on sending children of these industrialists, off to faux medieval schools in the countryside. And medievalism is actually the point. So many of the great public schools of England, regarded as totemic kind of public schools, have been in a fake medieval foundation. Most of them have, actually. So if you take my own school that I went to in Cranleigh, which was founded in 1887, it's actually in the most lovely of villages in Surrey, just outside the city of Guildford. That's a town that was actually established in about 880. There'd been a small village there from about that time. But the school itself was built as though it was from the 12th century. And so many of the schools, if you actually look at their websites now, you will see their kind of mock medieval Gothic buildings, which are kind of weighted, towards that. And of course, King's Cross Station is as well, which is what J.K. Rowling uses in the Harry Potter novels. And I always assumed that she used King Cross Station because it's actually the station that gets you to Edinburgh in Scotland, which is where she actually wrote the first Harry Potter book. But I don't think it's that at all. I think she bases it in London because that's actually where there's lots of Gothic spires and, all of the above. And I think it's supposed to give you that immediate feeling of ancientness. But what about the houses? So before the 19th century, most boys had kind of boarded in very ramshackle kind of surroundings. They might have all stayed in one house. They might have slept in the schoolroom. Some of them did. They might have stayed in the headmaster's house because if you remember listening to the first podcast, the headmasters used to rent their houses out to earn more money to the boys. And the point of the houses is that Dr. Arnold and his imitators, they want a much more disciplined, regimented system. And they're literally like army regiments. As in Hogwarts, it's divided into 4 competing houses. So the spirit of competition is built into the school immediately. This was a 19th century idea that you will teach the boys team spirit from the moment that they walk through the doors. And it's absolutely central to Arnold's vision, to the entire ethos of the kind of, Victorian ruling class. And of course, it's the ethos of Harry Potter, that the individual is never bigger than the team, that the most important thing is the collective rather than, your own personal gain. And the boarding house, your house, is the embodiment of all of that. The other thing about the house, and this is very important, is that it's governed by an incredibly complicated series of rules. And every house has its own set of rules. And outsiders actually find them utterly impenetrable and impossible to understand. And the impenetrability is the point. Now, in Victorian schools, this persisted well into the late 20th century. And you would learn the rules of the school and the special language of your house. And you're actually given to a test after 2 weeks of being there. And here's the thing. If you didn't pass the test, you would be beaten by your peers. And of course, Harry, when he arrives, he's nervous, as people are, and he is told to learn the rules of the school. His peers in Gryffindor, his house, the senior children in Gryffindor, are guiding the juniors and explaining to them the rules of the sports, all these kinds of things. And the one thing that they don't show you in Hogwarts, which is part of the kind of regimentation of the Victorian public school, the regimentation of something that went hand in hand with Victorian times, was the kind of cult of emotional reserve, something that existed well into the 1980s, of not exposing your emotions, of not crying because you're missing your mum. It's very early self-discipline, but it's a way of beating homesickness. It's the point. I mean, the Victorian teachers in the shadow of Arnold believed that self-discipline was a very positive good. It's the stiff upper lip again. You're under fire in the Sudan with General Gordon and you don't show a flicker of emotion. I mean, it's really important for an imperial power to have this kind of person, to produce this kind of person. Internationally, this person becomes the image of the gentleman. He's cold. He's emotionless. He's James Bond. He has ice in his veins. I mean, James Bond is actually the classic public school hero. And of course, this is something that you learn from public schools from the moment, from the first day that you actually attend. And of course, this is shown, and this stiff upper lip is also shown in Harry Potter. And of course, this brings us to Quidditch. So the joke about Quidditch, to some degree, is that Quidditch is a kind of made up, intricate, bizarre, absurd sport. But of course, all sports, cricket, to many of our American listeners, is no madder than Quidditch. But I understand rugby and I get rugby. But rugby is actually devised at rugby school. And, rugby, I played it for years, is really just subliminated violence, because that's the thing, isn't it? That these sports are individual to these public schools, but they're there to show you character. that you keep your stiff upper lip, during inversion. And this is the mania for, codifying games that in the long run will actually feed into the codification of games like football and rugby and so on. And public school boys are instrumental, of course, in all of it. And of course, famously, they have the Eton War game. And it's probably something you would never have heard of if you hadn't been to a public school. But it's famous within the public school system. I actually don't really know what it is, but I imagine it involves a war, and it seems to involve people rolling in mud. But the Eton, and you don't know about it because Eton, unless you actually go to Eton, and Etonians won't actually talk about it. It's just one of many such games that at the time were there to form character. And I think it's notable that this game still survives to today. And some schools have versions of these war games. We had one ourselves at Cranley, or something very similar. And it's a very weird kind of game that no one really understands unless you're actually part of the school. But here's the thing. Charterhouse, which is another public school, they had a game which is a bit like the rugby, war games, except that these boys, it had something to do with the balls of these boys. And all I know is that one boy actually died at one stage during Charterhouse. So, I mean, these games are meant to form character, but they can be bloody dangerous games. I mean, just thinking about cricket, because cricket is very distinctive, because already by this point, it's a national sport. And so in Tom Brown's Schooldays, one of the chaps says of cricket that it is the birthright of British boys, old and young, habeas corpus and trial by jury of British men, which is a splendid sentiment that he would do well to reflect upon. I mean, that's an amazing statement, but I think what happens in 19th century cricket is that the public schools' embrace of cricket kind of elevates it from a fun game that people played. They actually imbue cricket with this kind of moral unoldie and famously say it's more than a game, it's an institution. I mean, we hear that even now. This sort of grandiosity of the sort of public school moralism, the Corinthian spirit that people apply to all these games. Now by the end of the 19th century, the funny thing is, actually, by the way, Dr. Arnold himself was completely uninterested in all sports. It was actually his disciples who made this great attempt to institutionalize sport. I find that really ironic. People sometimes complain now that British schools are too concerned about sport. But in the 1880s, as an example, Uppingham School boys played vast quantities of football every single day. The headmaster actually made them do it. Schools like Eton, for instance, would have a huge variety of sports that people would be doing because sport was seen as the essence of life. It became to be seen as the absolute essence of manliness and moral character. And if I think about interviews that I went to for banking jobs, in the 1980s, one of the first questions that I was asked was, "Do you play rugby?" And if you answered yes to that question, it didn't matter how the rest of the interview went. You were almost guaranteed a job. But if I think back to the 1900s, and, earlier on I mentioned beastliness, and I said that I would talk about it a little bit later on. I think that time has finally come. Sports were actually invented in boarding schools as a way of stopping boys from obsessing about other boys. I don't think there is any great concern about boys obsessing about girls at this stage. I think the issue of boys obsessing with other boys is actually the issue. And I will talk about beastliness a little bit later. But just one thing about sports. So, yes, some headmasters are obsessed with the dangers of beastliness, and they believe that the best way to do this, to combat it, to fight it, is for the boys to do just nothing but sports all day long, so that they're actually too tired to think about anything else when they go to bed at night. However, some masters think, they notice that the boys, obviously when they're playing sport, their legs, for example, are exposed. And I think this is a fantastic story. So that at rugby, one teacher actually made all the boys wear longer, shorter shorts. So shorts that went down below the knees. And then he insisted that the shorts were then fastened with elastic bands or some kind of string so that absolutely no hint of flesh could be seen by the other boys in case they became excited by one another while they were playing football or rugby or whatever. Look, I have to say, as a sportsman, you're never thinking about what the other sportsmen are wearing. You're there to play the game. So I think that says more about the master than it actually does about the boys. And one thing that people who have read Harry Potter will know is that there is a kind of cult of the athletes. So, Victor Crumb, for instance, or Cedric Diggory, the characters that most resemble Tom, who's the cock of the school. There's a cult of athletes. And of course, that leads into the kind of cult of this sort of, not just the schoolboy sportsman, but later on, the soldier. Tolkien and his former rugby team, all 15 of them enlist in the Great War, and lots of them are killed. So there's a kind of a link between the sporting team and prowess and the sort of teamwork of military service of the empire, which you get, in that famous, Henry Newbolt poem. There's a breathless hush in the close tonight, 10 to make, the match to win, a bumping pitch and a blinding light, an hour to play, and the last man is in. And it's not for the sake of the ribboned coat or the selfish hope of a season's fame, but his captain's hand on his shoulder smote. Play up, play the game. It comes to be seen as a kind of index of British decadence, ironically so. And so even Kipling, has famous lines about, muddied oafs and flannelled fools. But we should talk about magic. So in his lessons, Harry is taught effectively a bizarre and impenetrable code that outsiders, muggles, cannot possibly understand, but which works to kind of bind the pupils at Hogwarts together as a community, separate from that outside world. And that's magic. And of course, in real life, in our life, it's the classics. So the fetish of, Latin and Greek at public schools, this is actually a leftover from the medieval period to some degree, and certainly from the Renaissance, which we can also discuss. I mean, people taught classics all the way through. I mean, classics have been there from the very beginning of the public schools in the 14th century, all the way through. And there's a brilliant book called Gilded Youth by an academic called James Brooks Smith. He actually says the profound linguistic alienation of classical study formed a complex network of rules and regulations that consumed the individual and the collective life, the institution. Why is it that so many public schools are so defensive about the study of Latin and Greek that they have never used since? Is it because they bear the indelible stamp of the public school initiation rite? Latin agreed with tools for identity formation as much as they were bodies of knowledge. For many, their appeal lay in a realm beyond the rational and utilitarian concerns of education. You know what, folks? That's magic. That's what he's talking about. So those who don't have Latin and Greek are muggles. So people in the Harry Potter universe who aren't witches or wizards. That's exactly it. Latin and Greek is a series of secret languages that you will get at British public boarding schools. So the other secret language is the language of the school itself, with all the weird terms, the slangs, the things, in the tuck shop and so on that only you know about. So much British humor, elite humor, is about institutions and secret languages and things. So Lewis Carroll had it, the Molesworth stories had it in the 1950s, the 60s and 70s movies that were set in St. Trinian's. Monty Python, the absurdism of Monty Python is so often about sending up institutions and mocking the language of institutions. That's very public school humor. So we haven't talked about the teachers. Right from the start, Harry is frightened by one particular teacher, Professor Snape. And most of the other teachers at Hogwarts are actually pretty benign. This was maybe, I think, fair to say, not always the case at Victorian public schools. I think they were full of terrifying Alan Rickman, Professor Snape figures. And of course, the thing that a boy would fear most at any public school, more than anything else, is punishment. And that punishment, 9 times out of 10, was a beating. And I did a podcast recently about, the Marquis de Sade, and he would absolutely have loved life in a British boarding school back in the 19th century. Because he loved regimentation and the depersonalization and all the other things, which is basically what Victorian schools were all about. And so there's a connect. And there's a great Canadian sociologist in the mid-19th century called Irving Goffman. And he talked about total institutions. And the Victorian public school was the ultimate total institution. And that's one of the reasons why they work so well as stories, because it's a self-contained world. And people love self-contained worlds. And it's one of the reasons, and I'll be interesting to hear what some of my listeners think, but it's one of the reasons why Star Trek is so loved and has carried through for the past 50 years. And it's certainly also true of the Aubrey Maturin books. And I absolutely love those books from Patrick O'Brien, Master and Commander, etc. Without exaggeration, I've read those books at least 4 times. And we love them so much, not just because of the characters, but because they're self-contained worlds within their own hierarchies. They have their own rules, they have their own languages, and they're also brilliant stories. And of course, it's why kids absolutely adore Harry Potter. The critic Catherine Hughes, many, many years ago, was writing about Harry Potter, the appeal of Harry Potter. And she said, children who were never going to go to a boarding school often love boarding school stories because they love the idea of all the rules that they have to learn, of all the traditions of the school, of all the codes of conduct. It's certainly one of the reasons why The Twins at St. Clair's by Enid Blyton sold so well, which is actually about a girls' boarding school. And these stories can absolutely still have an incredible hold over children in the 21st century because they know nothing about this world. Any parent who's read the Harry Potter books to their children or see their children with Harry Potter books know the power that the school story can have. It's another reason why Billy Bunter was so popular with kids in state schools or private schools, because everything about public school life was baffling to them. The stuff about Virgil, of having to translate Virgil, and all the beatings that took place. They were addicted to all that kind of stuff. So just on the beatings part of the institutions of Victorian public schools, the public ritual of flogging or beating was absolutely central to public schools. And many a famous man were actually beaten so much at these schools that it actually became a very safe place for them. And they would actually seek out places to be beaten when they became adults. I kid you not. So Charterhouse, a school founded in 1611, I used to play rugby against them. People there, students there, would be beaten with a bunch of birch switches. At rugby, they had a thin wooden cane, which was actually weighted with lead at the end. But at rugby, they actually had a special flogging block or a kind of altar where your peers would actually stand and formally watch you being caned. But here's the thing, at Eton, you would actually go upstairs to the headmaster's study, and the stairs would be lined by boys in your year. A bit like being taken to the guillotine. You can imagine the atmosphere. Some boys, your friends, their faces would be stricken with feeling. Other boys who didn't like you, their faces would be contorted with glee. And actually, the historian Heather Ellis actually says that this has a kind of political renaissance. The more trouble the British Empire was in, the more it seems that public schools were actually keen on flogging, because they're actually anxious about forming character and about discipline. The greater sense of anxiety in society as a whole, the state of the nation, the more beatings, the more floggings, the more canings seem to have increased in public schools. And that's because you're sending these boys out into that world. So you had to harden them up. We go back to the stiff upper lip. And I think this is an interesting correlation, because the feeling is that you're being dominated and you dominate from a very early age. You have servants and you beat them because you're actually going out into the British Empire and doing exactly the same with colonies that you're then ruling or going out to administer over. I mentioned in the last podcast a very good book by David Turner. He wrote a book called The Old Boys and the Rise and Decline of Public Schools. Very, very good book if you want to read more about this. He actually quotes a teacher at Harrow School in 1928 that to learn to obey as a fag is part of the routine that is the essence of the English public school system. Those who hope to rule must first learn to obey. And that has an obvious relevance, I guess, for a ruling class that is anxious about the possible collapse of an empire, which did start to collapse after 1947, 1948. And effectively, what you're doing is you're going on from a public school into another institution. It could be the Church of England, it could be the civil service, it could be as an official in India, it could be the army or the navy. So you're actually going to move into another hierarchical system where you will at once again be at the bottom and you have to work your way up to the top. So that idea of obedience and giving orders, it's really, really important for headmasters to instill this into boys at a very early age. One of the consequences of the beatings, from one historian, reckons that about half of all the erotic works that were published in the late 19th century in Britain had flagellation as the key theme. It's very La Vie Sanglée, isn't it? The mistress of flagellation, the history of the rod, the quintessentialness of the birch discipline. And these were actually some of the titles of the books that came out at that time. And I think what's also interesting about these books that are coming out in the 19th century is that they are aimed at a public school audience because they're too expensive for working class readers to buy. They're 2 or 3 guineas to buy. So in other words, you have to be rich to buy them, just like you have to be rich to go to those schools. They are, at this time, they are aimed at a particular clientele. And it's at this time where we see a massive amount of flagellation brothels in London and in Paris and Berlin setting up, completely across the continent, because this is seen again as a very kind of English specialization. And there's no doubt that it comes from public schools. So a pornographic publisher called George Cannon, he actually wrote about these brothels and he actually questioned it. He said, why are they so popular? Well, it's because hundreds of young men, thousands of young men, having been through, these educational institutions where the masters were fond of administering the birch discipline and recollecting certain sensations produced by it, have literally imbibed a passion for it. And these students have actually longed to receive the same chastisement from the hands of fine women. So even at the time, people think there's something odd going on here. And of course, we mentioned before anxieties about the boys interfering with each other. They are definitely there. So at Wellington College, just as an example, they had to install barbed wire entanglements on top of the dormitory cubicles to stop the boys breaking out at night to interfere with each other. So just one more thing before we move on to something we've not talked about at all. I haven't talked about the girls. Boys are not just interfering with one another. There's a very famous story by a guy called John Addington Symonds. Symonds said at Harrow when you arrived, the better-looking boys were immediately given female names by the older boys. And that's also in Tom Brown's Schooldays. Arthur, the boy who prays. It's referring to boys like him and new boys like him. He's a bit of a weed. He's a little bit susceptible. But these new boys at Harrow would be given female names. They would be called names like Molly or Jenny. But they're not being called Molly and Jenny in a derogatory way. They're being called Molly and Jenny in an appraising way. And Symonds actually said that what would happen is that the better looking younger boys would be adopted by an older boy and called, and I quote, his bitch or his tart, and then he would perform various services, various fag-like services. Symonds said that at Harrow in the 1850s, one could not avoid seeing acts of mutual masturbation, sports of naked boys in bed together. A friend of mine is obsessed by this kind of stuff. And when we had lunch recently, he spent the entire lunch endlessly quizzing me about what happened at my boarding school. Was it true? Did we do this or did we do that? And my answer to all of these questions is absolutely no, because this was a different time. We're talking 1850s versus 1970s and 80s. But I find it fascinating that he's actually fascinated by that secret culture, which is one of the reasons why we're so enamored by Harry Potter. So Symonds would actually write about this. And at one point, Symonds, his best friend actually comes to him, a guy called Peter Preter, comes to him and he says, look, I've got interesting news. A bit of a secret. I've been having an affair with the headmaster. And the headmaster of Harrow at that stage was one of Arnold's disciples, a man called Charles Bourne. And he had become headmaster at Harrow aged 28. And you know how cricketers or sports people all kind of talk of people as a future captain or a future, England captain or captain of, Canada or something at a sport. Well, he was actually being talked about as a future Archbishop of Canterbury. This was how revered this man was. But this definitely didn't help his cause, because basically Simmons then told his father, who then decided to blackmail Charles Bourne, and he had to step down for having had an affair with this boy, and he ended up becoming a parish priest in Doncaster. I mean, a bit of a come down. But the reason that I mention him is because this doesn't happen in Harry Potter for one reason. Girls. Hogwarts has girls. So, Hermione Granger, who I have to say is a very, very stereotyped girl, isn't she? She's just a girly swat. She's very annoying. So Hogwarts has girls. Of course, they weren't co-educational schools in the 19th century. They really didn't come in until after the Second World War. And as I mentioned in the last podcast, there were girls' schools. I'm not completely not mentioning girls' schools for a reason. And the prototype girls' schools were Cheltenham College, Cheltenham Ladies' College, for instance, which was set up in 1853, and Rodine, which was set up in 1885. And of course, then you had Wickham Abbey. So, there are schools for people, for girls whose parents are going overseas. And that's why they were primarily set up. And they're set up because they want their girls to stay in Britain to become educated. But they were regarded generally as pretty atrocious schools academically, by comparison to the boys' schools. So, ladies would spend, a quarter of their time doing music. A lot of the time they would be doing needlework. And of course, they would learn a modern language. So they would learn French, certainly not Latin or Greek, and they do a fair amount of sport as well. They play a lot of hockey. And also lacrosse. Of course, they don't have cultures of beatings and the physical side and all that kind of stuff. And of course, they also have a strange bunch of super mad rules. My favorite ones were from the North London Collegiate. The girls there were actually banned from gathering in groups of more than 3. And that was actually considered a serious business. And the other crazy rule that I love is that they were very specifically banned from getting wet on the way to school. It was very unladylike and highly punishable. And the government did a report. It was called the Taunton Commission Report. It came out in 1886. And that commission basically said that there are 2 problems with girls' schools, teaching girls in schools. One was that the teachers didn't know anything about teaching. And 2 is that the teachers didn't know anything about their subjects. But apart from that, they were absolutely brilliant. And I guess one of the big changes, and this obviously coincided with J.K. Rowling, starting the Harry Potter series, is that public schools became co-educational. But actually, there's still quite a few schools that are boys only. Eton's one of them. But public schools on the whole are largely co-educational. And they now live and die, and this is the big change, by their exams. I mean, that's why people spend all their money sending their kids to public schools. It's not really to learn character anymore, or manliness, or womanliness, or whatever it's all about. It's all about basically getting good grades and to go to university. But one of the things that Harry Potter does is to kind of re-import that idea of the Victorian idea that you become a better person. And I like that. Yes, it's all about exams, which is why we see Hermione, doing as well as she does, but it's about becoming a better person. And that is something that public schools now buy into 100%. It's absolutely central to the public school. And if you visit any public school website now, they will tell you right from the start, right from the outset, that it's about character. We're forming the citizens of tomorrow, the change makers of the 21st century, and all that kind of stuff. But is that actually true, or is it just kind of fashionable window dressing? I was reading, about these public schools to do this podcast, and I read that St. Paul's Girls' School They've actually abolished, the title of head girl because it's too binary. They're a very woke school. And some public schools now are incredibly woke. And Eton, just to mention it, is also decolonizing its curriculum, in all fairness. So the funny thing about Hogwarts is it's multicultural. It also has the Patel sisters. It has Lee Jordan, who is black. J.K. Rowling actually goes out of her way to make it diverse, which is one of the other things I love about it. And the existence of girls means that although it looks like a Victorian public school, in that sense, it's absolutely nothing like a Victorian public school because it's far more feminized than any Victorian public school ever was or ever will be. But at the same time, you have this idea that they are an elite. They are separate from the muggles. I mean, that remains hard baked into it, doesn't it? And in that sense, public schools remain absolutely separate from the vast mass of children who are going to state schools or, private schools or whatever. And I think that opens up a whole question, which we haven't discussed in this episode, which I did discuss in the first episode, which is where did public schools come from? One comment I'd like to make about J.K. Rowling is that pace and brevity, I don't think it's actually one of her strong points. Though I may not necessarily be the best person to make that observation. We've been talking about the Victorian public school and Hogwarts and all the public school stories and traditions that lie between Tom Brown's Schooldays and J.K. Rowling. But where did that concept come from? How old is it? Does it go back to before the Norman conquest? If not, where does it go back to? And for that information, if you haven't listened to episode 1, please do, because I do cover it. Listeners, thank you for listening in. Bye for now.